Father Witherow looks for help, as help looks for him. An evil grows bored and playful in an empty building. Alice listens closely as the bridge speaks to her one last time. Welcome to Hidden Oaks. Father Witherow sat at his desk, with the phone cradled between his right shoulder and his ear. The soft piano hold music played as he waited. It had been nearly 10 minutes, and this was the third time holding on this call alone. He'd grown used to this pattern lately. Several days ago he had reached out to the bishop of his diocese for help with the strange and sometimes violent issues he and his community had been facing this summer. His concern had been heard, and he had been passed along to diocesan bishops and archbishops in a few areas of Europe that he was told may be better suited to help him. What had surprised him the most in this series of calls for assistance was the lack of shock when he was extremely candid about the nature of evil forces at work. The leaders within the church seemed to be relatively unfazed by this kind of thing, as though they had encountered it before. Again, he knew the church had a history with dealing with the paranormal, but he didn't think it would have been something common. He still expected at least one of them to be startled by his story of the dark, smiling monster in the fireplace that bit the leg off the woman down the street, or that of the dead man speaking to him in person. But no reaction like that of yet. If nothing else, the calm, collected nature of the responses was impressive, and at least he kept getting passed on to more people who may have answers or be able to offer some help. He felt that he was getting closer to an answer. He drummed his fingers on the desk as he waited for the bishop to answer. It was the middle of the night. He had found the need to start making these calls late so that he could catch the individuals he was looking for during the morning, when they had scheduled office hours and time to take phone calls. Ireland had a 6-hour lead on Central Standard Time, so catching Bishop O'Halloran for their 8 a.m. appointment call meant being awake at 2 a.m. And now, being on hold until nearly 2:30. The piano sonata on the hold's playlist wasn't helping his wakefulness as he sat there. Tim's eyes were starting to close and his head beginning to nod forward when a voice in a pleasant Irish lilt came suddenly to his ear. He nearly dropped the phone as he startled up from his near doze.
"Father, are you still with me?"
asked the voice. "Oh, yes, sorry, just about nodded off there. It's very late here, you understand."
Yes, Father. It's okay. I'm sorry we've had you wait for so long. Thank you for your patience.
"It's okay, Bishop O'Halloran, sir. Thank you for making the time to speak with me,"
Of course, Father Witherow.
answered the bishop, who continued.
Now, I'll have to keep this short, and I believe we may have some help for you. Your stories have been relayed to me in full. I've heard about the woman and her leg. I've heard about the dead in your cemetery. Believe it or not, we've had events exactly similar to this on our side of the pond, in the not-so-distant past as well.
"Really?" exclaimed Father Witherow, interrupting the bishop. Silence on the other end of the phone, followed by a gentle throat clearing, confirmed the bishop was waiting for the interruption to be acknowledged with an apology before he continued. "I'm sorry to interrupt, Bishop. Please, go on."
Yes, really. Forces such as these are no stranger to us.
"What should I do about them? How can I help the dead to rest?"
Well, Timothy, we would advise that you allow the events to take their natural course.
You want me to let these things keep on terrorizing both the living and the dead of my parish?
Ideally, God's plan will see that the events work themselves out to his conclusion,
replied the bishop. Father Witherow sat with his mouth agape for several moments. He couldn't believe that the response from the Catholic Church to something so clearly nefarious would be to just ride it out. "So that's it? You all have talked to each other at all different levels of leadership, and that's the help you can give me? I don't mean to question your guidance, but Both living and dead of my community have come to me asking for me to intervene and assist them. I don't know how I can just wait that out." There was another pause as the bishop seemed to consider Father Witherow's response.
Can I place you on one more brief hold, Father? I think there's possibly one other thing I can consider.
He did not wait for a response from Tim before hitting the hold button yet again. Bishop O'Halloran laid the phone down on his desk and picked up a second phone that had been sitting off the hook to his right. "Are you still there, Davies?" asked the bishop. The deep voice with the British accent that had been on the line waiting for him answered.
I'm still here, Kieran.
It was the voice of Bishop William Davies of the Diocese of London, which oversaw over 480 Catholic churches in 413 different parishes. He had been the center of the web of calls Father Witherow had made over the past several weeks. It was he who was in charge of making the final decision regarding the case. "He doesn't appear willing to back down from this one. He feels as though it's his duty to intervene."
I am beginning to come to the same conclusion with this man. Tenacious. I just wish he were trying to persevere on some cause that was, I don't know, more fruitful for the church, more worthy of his time. We're between a rock and a hard place, so to speak, for this one, Kieran.
"I'm afraid he's going to keep working on this whether we do something about it or not. His heart is really in it, this Timothy Witherow, and he still has all that youthful energy."
The problem is that the church has a strict stance on this, and has for hundreds of years now. We do not interfere with these beings. That's all there is to it. But we can't just let everyone know what it is we're working with, either. It would cause utter panic. We're just lucky that it isn't very often that our people come into contact with these things. But then again, every several decades or so. Anyway.
He paused. While he did, Bishop O'Halloran continued. "So what do you think we'll tell him? I'm new to this kind of thing. I wasn't around in the 60s when you had to deal with similar things yourself, William. How do we keep him from interfering, but also make a show of support to him?"
I have thought on this, and I think we've reached this point by now. We'll send him Father Jack Bly.
"Father Jack? From the Leitrim parish? You can't mean the same man," answered Bishop O'Halloran, sounding completely taken aback by the suggestion.
I mean the self-same man,
responded Davies in a calm and sure voice. "But he's completely demented. He's been living in a home for years and he still gets completely drunk regularly. What would that man possibly do to help this American priest?"
Father Jack will give him something else to concentrate on. By his grace, it will take just enough of his time and attention that he no longer meddles in the events that are unfolding.
"Ah, I see. Is there anything else we need to do to set this up, I mean?"
I already have the ball in motion. I can have the old man there in just a few days. Let him know that help is on the way, and he'll probably let his guard down. I'd say we'll buy ourselves at least a week or two. And by the sounds of it, that is more than enough time for things to come to their own natural conclusion before he realizes any difference. Thank you for working with us on this, and for being the main point of contact with the American. I'll get things in motion. Good day. God bless.
"Thank you, Bishop. God bless." He hung up the phone and thought for a few moments before picking the call back up with Father Witherow. He had to choose his words wisely and think of contingency plans in case the priest started asking more questions. He picked up the receiver and pushed the hold button.
Father Witherow, are you still awake? Still with me?
A voice yawned on the other end of the line. I am. I'm still here."
We found someone in the church who is something of an expert in the type of events you've described to us. He's an older priest from a parish in Western Ireland. His name is Jack Bly. He has directly faced this type of activity before. We are already in the process of sending him to join you. He should be arriving in just a matter of days. We'll call you again soon with his arrival information, and the two of you can work on confronting your problems in person. How do you feel about this solution, Father?
I don't know what to say. Sending me actual help? That is so much more than I was expecting. I can't thank you enough. Thank you. Thank you. A personal understanding of events like this is exactly what we need. It's all just so strange, so much to wrap one's mind around. Oh, thank you. Really. This will help me sleep more easily at night for sure. Thank you.
Of course, Father. And now, if you don't mind, I have to be off to attend some other duties for the day. And by the sounds of it, you need to be heading to bed yourself. You sound exhausted, son.
I am.
Well, get some rest. We'll call you in a day or two to let you know when Father Bly will arrive to help you out.
Thank you again. Good morning, Bishop.
Thank you. Good night to you, Father. God bless.
The line clicked dead, and Father Witherow sat back in his chair with a heavy, relieved sigh. This was wonderful. He couldn't believe he was going to get the help he so desperately needed, and in so short a time. He already didn't feel as alone in all this as he had leading into the phone call. The entire summer, really. He stood up, yawned again, stretched, and made sure he had everything he needed. Then he walked to the door of his office, turned out the lights, and closed it. As he made his way through the corner of the sanctuary, a voice from the shadows behind the back pews greeted his ears.
Timothy Witherow, yes?
Tim paused and looked to the back of the sanctuary. There he saw a figure standing in the shadows. She stepped into the light as she spoke. She was short and feminine, but also clearly strong in figure. Not much over 5 feet tall. Her red hair was pulled tightly into a high bun. She wore a crisply ironed navy pantsuit with light blue pinstripes and a similarly light blue blouse on beneath it. He couldn't believe how well put together this woman was at this hour of the night. In addition to her state of dress, he felt suddenly snapped awake by her commanding presence. He could tell she was someone who controlled whatever room she was in. He began to walk down the aisle toward her. Yes, can I help you?
Actually, from what I was told by Agent Ousting, you already have. We're here to return the favor.
I only see one of you. You said we.
One of my agents is outside waiting for us.
That's certainly kind, but I'm terribly exhausted. I haven't been sleeping well lately. Can this wait until tomorrow?
Listen, I'm going to be blunt. We're here to help you with your cemetery problem. And no, it can't wait. You want the help now, or you don't. So let's get to it. This won't take long. The nature of what we are doing and why it needs to be done in the middle of the night will soon be obvious.
All right. Thank you so much for the help. Lead the way. She turned and walked out through the front doors of the church. The priest easily fell in line behind her. Outside the church, about 30 feet down the street, a black sedan sat parked along the curb near the cemetery. As she led him toward it, Father Witherow said to the woman, I have to ask, how is Richard, Agent Ousting?
He asked for a transfer from field work. It was wearing on him. He's doing well, though. The change of pace was therapeutic for him.
Good. That helps my heart to know. He's a good man. What was your name again?
Mira.
That was my mother's name. They reached the car, and a thin man with messy black hair that looked like it hadn't touched water in days stepped out of the passenger side door. He was wearing thick glasses and was in one of the characteristic black suits like the ones that Father Witherow had grown used to seeing the agents wear.
Mr. Witherow, this is Agent Friedman. He will explain the system that will help your groundskeeping issue.
Hello, Agent Friedman. Okay, so this is a pretty neat deal. I call it a dolus prism, and you'll see why in a minute. Dolus is Latin for trick or deceit. Oh, Latin, you're a priest, so you'll know that already. It's something we expanded off Agent Thane's old universal power module. See, the more power we put in, the more effect comes out.
You might want to start by explaining what it actually does, Agent.
Oh, right. Well, first of all, here it is. Friedman had walked around to the trunk of the car by this time. He turned the key in the lock and now threw open the lid. A bland, green, 2-foot steel cube structure stared back at them. It had venting ribs all down the sides, along with a few random orange warning stickers that they couldn't make out well in the dark. It looks like you stole one of the power company's utility boxes. Exactly. That's a camouflage of sorts. People generally stay away from that kind of stuff. Most people don't even like to mow near them. Don't you think that might be a little conspicuous in the middle of the cemetery? I'll deal with that in a minute. Here, hold it. Friedman lifted the device out of the trunk. It looked as though it would be heavy, but when he shifted it into Father Witherow's hands, the priest was surprised yet again at how light the device was. Light, right? It's also got its own built-in power source, as I mentioned. I'm telling you, Commander, it's perfect for field deployment.
It's wonderful, Agent Friedman. Can we get it set up rather than talking about it so much? Mr. Witherow here wants to get home and go to sleep. As do I.
Agent Friedman took the device back from Father Witherow. Mira walked ahead of them and opened the cemetery gate, and the three walked inside. This thing has a pretty good range. I'd say 250 to 300 foot diameter at 3/4 power. Do you know about where the center of the graveyard is? I'd guess it's right over this way. He led them another 50 feet or so away from the church, further into the cemetery, and surveyed the area in the moonlight. Father Witherow thought they were close to a central location anyway. Friedman walked around the device several times, looking in multiple directions, seeming to survey the scene before muttering assent under his breath. So, how does it work? Okay, follow me. It's best if we see it from the road. So there are these illusions that spark up with the energy from the forest, right? We've all seen that by now. Well, this, in essence, harnesses the energy that's already here. From that, it's able to bend what we've determined is the time component of those illusion fields. Here, take this remote, and now push the red button. There, see?
Agent, I thought you said this would project a forest.
Huh. Well, that is weird. I was expecting trees. My word. It's just like it's all gone. It's just prairie grasses.
You've outdone yourself, Agent. Good work. With all the prairie restoration hype going on, this'll work out just fine.
But where did this come from, this image? What you're seeing is another time. The area under the power field appears as it did probably hundreds of years ago. When we tested it a block over, we had old-growth forest, so the prairie grasses, it's a bit surprising, but...
The corner of the fence is showing through a little.
Oh, here. The agent reached for the remote, and Father Witherow handed it to him. If you need the span a little wider, you just increase the power. More power in, more effect out, remember. Just up or down on this dial here. And the other thing, this illusion bending, we think it may also have some kind of a dampening effect on the energy disruptions under the dome. As he nudged the dial toward the plus sign, the width of the illusion moved toward the road, swallowing up the exposed piece of fencing. It now appeared that beyond the sidewalk and a small strip of grass, the yard of the church had been restored to prairie. What do you mean by that? The energy disruptions?
Basically, it means your friends in there might not be as affected by what's going on out there in the forest, as long as the device is on.
Father Witherow began to slowly walk across the several feet of mowed grass between the roadside and the start of the prairie illusion. He stretched his hand out toward the image in front of him. Is this safe to touch? Oh, sure, it's only a kind of projection. All we're doing is tweaking the energy that's already here from... As he said this, Father Witherow's head poked through the plane of the illusion dome. Mira stepped beside him and leaned through the image as well. On the other side, the two of them simply saw the cemetery they had seen before. They leaned out and looked at Agent Friedman.
Well, what good is that? I think it's going to be a problem, Agent. It only works as long as no one decides to walk through it. I'm going to need you to do better than that.
No, don't worry. I already thought of that too. The second part should solve all your concerns.
Would you hurry up, please? The sun is rising soon, and we need this to be in place by then.
Yes, Commander. The agent hurried back over to the trunk of the car. He leaned in and rifled around for a minute before emerging with what appeared to be tin signs on stakes. He hustled over to the corner of the property and started placing the signs in the ground every 40 to 50 feet. He walked the perimeter away from Mira and Tim. Coming around the other side, he waited to place the last sign directly in front of his commander and the priest, pausing and looking at them for dramatic effect before doing so. Then, raising his arms in a flourish toward the sign. There, in red block letters, were the words, "Landscape Restoration. Keep off the grass." Mac Richter had been having an excellent week. He had 3 closings scheduled for Friday. He had multiple clients with offers that were being considered. And today, He was showing a big commercial property he'd been sitting on for a while to an inquiring buyer. One of his partners had purchased the large central unit of Moore Lake Plaza as a tax write-off just a few months earlier, but now someone had come out of nowhere and was interested in the space for a new business venture. On top of all that, the weather was beautiful. It had been all week. He drove his black 1996 Mitsubishi Eclipse down Highway 65 with the top down. It was the first year that this model had been made with a convertible top. He loved his car. It had been his gift to himself last year after his first time ever bringing in over $300,000 of income. The wind barely even moved his heavily slicked back black hair and only gently ruffled his brown suit with its cobalt blue and ivory striped tie. He smiled in a big toothy grin. His large, straight, pearly teeth were like chiclet gum lined up in two perfect rows. Weeks like this always made him think about what a great decision it had been to leave his life as a high school history teacher and venture into real estate. Mac turned into Moore Lake Plaza and shot across the lot, entirely heedless of the lanes of parking spaces. The lot was empty. It was just after 7 a.m. and the first stores didn't open until 8. He was early for his 7:30 meeting. He always tried to be early so he could prepare his information for the property and be ready to answer as many questions without hesitation as possible. He parked in the first space outside of the central shop of the L-shaped strip mall. He had only been looking over his papers for a few minutes when a brand new pearl white Jaguar sedan pulled slowly into the spot next to his. The windows were tinted too darkly for him to see inside. He didn't need to wait long to learn who was driving this flashy ride. Just after the engine stopped, a tall, thin woman with long, wavy blonde hair stepped out of the driver's side door. She was wearing Maui Jim sunglasses and a nice dark navy blouse tucked into stylishly flowing black dress pants. She was middle-aged, and between her hair, makeup, fancy clothes, and car, it was clear that she spent a lot of time and money on her appearance. She introduced herself to Mac as Susan Halverson, the client he was expecting to meet here. They made small talk for a few minutes before getting down to business. So the place has been vacant for just about 2 years. It's a great space, about 10,000 square feet total, including the storage room in the back. But it's really large out front. Used to be a huge arcade. They had mini golf and everything in there too. What are your initial thoughts for a space like this, just so I have an idea as we walk through? One of my partner's ventures is to open up a series of independent gyms with cheaper memberships, to be used any time, day or night. We basically just need a large space for all the machines, weights, and for people to be active in, and they'll do the rest. Well, we need the equipment too, but we're working on that. Right now, we need the space. That's fantastic. It's sure to catch on like wildfire. Should we go take a look at your potential first location? Yeah, I'm excited. The two began to walk from their cars to the mall. Mac continued telling Susan about the space as they went. They were letting the custodian do a little storage here for a while since it was vacant for so long, but that can be removed pretty quickly pending a sale. From what I understand, it doesn't diminish the space much, but we'll see how packed it is. I honestly haven't even been in here myself since my associate bought it a few months back. I've been doing this for a while now, and you wouldn't believe what businesses like this leave behind sometimes. Really? Oh yeah, I sold a space that used to be an ice cream shop last year. They left so much equipment the new people could have basically started a whole new business out of that stuff alone. Mac led her to the glass front doors and unlocked them. He walked in before Susan and held the door open with an outstretched arm so she could join him. The space was dark and the air was cool and dry. There was clearly no issue with the air conditioning or ventilation of this building. The smell of dust greeted their nostrils as they entered. They stood just inside the doors, letting their eyes adjust to the dim light. They both removed their sunglasses. An odd crinkling sound greeted their ears as they stood there, and as they began to make out the shapes before them, they realized its source quickly. Large blue and brown tarps covering dozens of cardboard boxes and some old arcade game cabinets rippled as the air exchange from the open door disturbed them. After the door closed and the air settled, so did the tarps, and an eerie silence fell over the large room. I guess there was a little more in here than I was expecting. I'm sorry about that. I hope you can still get an idea of the space. Also, if you'd like, we can have this all removed and do another showing," said Mac, wringing his hands with a somewhat pained look on his face. "Mac, really, it's fine. I'm not the type to worry about things like that. I know it can be cleaned out. I'm not one of those buyers with zero imagination. A little clutter won't stop me from seeing what this place could be," replied Susan. With that, the two began walking further into the building. Beyond the front doors and rectangular vestibule, the room opened into a semi-divided space with a large open shared ceiling. They had to come around stacks of boxes that were above their eye level to fully appreciate this, but once they did, Susan said, "This place really opens up. You can't really tell from outside since it tucks back into the corner and all, but there's a lot of room here." "There really is," said the realtor. "What's that?" asked Susan. "What?" "Right there," said Susan, pointing and walking toward the end of a row of boxes. There, on a ledge created by a larger bottom row box, was a small pyramid made out of sticks. Mac bent down and looked at it. It was about the size of a flower vase. There were 3 main sticks making the vertical arms of the pyramid that reminded Mac of a Native American teepee. Then there were several horizontal smaller sticks that appeared to be held to the vertical ones with something like cobwebs. He was slowly reaching his hand out to touch it when suddenly Susan said, "Wow, this place just keeps going." He shot upright and turned around. She had moved on and continued into the building while he had been mesmerized by the object she had pointed out to him. He couldn't think of a word for the thing. Cairn came to mind, but that wasn't quite right. He joined her in the larger part of the room. To the right, a wall came 3/4 of the way across the space, but was open on this end and the other. This is where the arcade games had been. There were no windows here, as it was an inside wall. And since the area was separated from the rest of the space, it was much darker as well. The whole building was full of stacks of boxes and draped tarps. The expanse of the rooms could still be visualized, but navigating the rows was like walking through a maze. The central area was large, high-ceiled, and wide open, apart from the cluttered boxes and things. Then, across this expanse to the left was an area that was surrounded by a low, waist-high partition. Within this space, it was clear that a lot of infrastructure had been torn out and moved. This had been the mini-golf section, as evidenced by the numerous scattered golf balls and a few bent or broken putters leaned against the wall. "We almost wouldn't have to change a thing," called Susan from somewhere ahead of Mac. "This front area could be for the free weights or calisthenic exercises, the big central area for the weight machines. Is that where the bathrooms are over there?" "Where are you?" said Mac, walking more quickly and looking for his client. He found her around the second corner. "Oh, here you are," he said. She looked at him, smiled, and pointed across the old mini-golf area where a hall led into the back of the building. It was framed in and had a low ceiling. The hall was dark, but enough light from the skylights showed a brief glimpse beyond the entrance. A tarp was draped over what appeared to be a drinking fountain in the large open doorway leading into the hall. "Yeah, I believe that's where the restrooms are," answered Mac. "That's great. We could open that up and add on to them if we need to, for showers or just bigger locker rooms. And then over here, where this low wall is, we can have a couple of rows of treadmills, bikes, and stair climbers. They can face these walls, and we'll put some TVs around there for people to watch." "Oh, sure, yeah, that would be perfect," said Mac, not really that interested, but feigning it well. "Hey, look, there's more of those things like we saw out front." Susan pointed to a few different areas around them. Here and there, seemingly at random, more of the small stick teepees were scattered about. He began to look around more carefully. Here in the large central room, he began to notice that there were more than just a few. He saw at least 7. They were different sizes, some nearly twice as large as the first one they had seen. Some were built on top of an old arcade cabinet shell, more than 6 feet off the ground and beyond Mac's reach. There was one near the 2 of them, and they leaned slightly toward it for a better look. This one was clearly made not only out of sticks, but also bones, and what looked like teeth. Maybe the bones of a chicken, Mac thought. He couldn't see through the cracks in this one as well because it was covered in cobwebs, but when he bent down to look, he saw the carcasses of 2 small birds lying beneath it. along with more teeth. God, I'm so sorry about the state of this place. This is getting a bit creepy. I love the location, though. I'm not super excited about the junk, but hey, if I buy this, I won't be the one cleaning it up. I wonder what all these things were for, though, replied Susan. She still sounded like she was in a good enough mood. She seemed happy and positive, and it made him feel the same with the growing thought that this was going to end in another sale. Should we go peek into the bathrooms and the storage area? Then we can wrap up here. I'm thinking maybe what we want to do is have them come and get some of this crap out of here, and then we can come back and look again. What do you think? Asked Mac. Yeah, that sounds good. I think I have a pretty decent idea of the layout, but it would be nice to see without all this in here. As they began to make their way toward the back of the building, a loud twang, followed by a few more gentle thuds, came to their ears and made them both jump. It sounded like it had come from the entrance hall. They both looked toward the front doors, but their view was obscured by high stacks of clutter. They looked at each other, but didn't say anything. Their expressions couldn't hide the unease that was growing in them both. Mac reached the hallway first and flipped the switch on the wall just inside. A dim, flickering light emanated from about half of the fluorescence. Mac opened the first door to the left. It was the woman's restroom. He flipped the switch inside and the lights came on brightly. A row of stalls to the left and 3 sinks with mirrors on the right. There was nothing particularly noteworthy about the room. The two of them looked in for a few moments. Then Susan turned and walked over to the other door. She opened it and flipped the light switch. Nothing happened. The room was pitch black. The light from the front room did not reach into the bathroom. The hall lights here were completely out, not just flickering. Mac pulled a small flashlight out of his inside coat pocket. He clicked it on as he walked over. Neither of them were prepared for what they saw when he shined it into the men's room. Only a few feet in front of them at eye level were a crow and a large rat. 2 carcasses dangling from strings set into the ceiling. Susan screamed. Mac gasped. They both stepped back and let the door to the bathroom close. There was no dramatic slam, just the slow hiss of the hydraulic arm as it eased the door toward the frame where it shut with a snick of the lock. The two stood next to each other. They had each reached out reflexively and touched one another's arms. A low laugh greeted their ears. "This isn't funny. Are you nuts? I don't like this," said Susan nervously. "I don't think it's funny either." "Then why are you laughing?" "That wasn't me. It was probably one of the old games or something," returned Mac. "Okay, I'm done. Let's go. I'll come back when this place is cleaned out. This is too fucking creepy," said Susan in a voice that was beginning to show her fear. "Yeah, I'm with you on that one. Let's go." Quickly they wound their way back to the front doors of the building. Here they saw the cause of the crash they had heard earlier. A stack of storage items had partially collapsed and a few were sitting on the floor, blocking the walkway between 2 stacks that led to the entrance. They pushed through the debris on the floor, and as they scraped around, the box walls rocked back and forth next to them. Max swore he heard laughter from deep within the building again. Mac quick-stepped over to the entrance, stretched out his arm, and crashed into the door, which did not move under his weight. Then he remembered. It was a pull door. But when he suddenly began to pull on the door, it again remained locked within its frame. He fumbled in his pants pocket for the keys, which he pulled out and tried to jam into the lock with shaking hands. After scraping back and forth over the keyhole, the slim piece of metal slid home. He turned the key, felt the mechanism turn, and began to pull the door again. When it still didn't budge, he looked at the door jamb. He could see the deadbolt across the gap. It had been unlocked when he had tried the door the first time. When he turned the key, he had locked it. He unlocked it again and both pulled and pushed it. Still, it held fast. He began to shake it in its frame frantically. He could hear Susan saying something in a worried voice behind him, but he was too focused to take notice. He turned the key back and forth. He locked it yet again, and then turned it back so hard that the key snapped off in the lock. Then he spotted something else. A glint of light caught off something that was nearly transparent. A series of what looked like wires was somehow wrapped around the entire frame of the door, holding it in place. Just then the laughter erupted again from behind them. It seemed to echo from multiple places at once. The two looked at one another. Susan's eyes were wide with panic. She had a hand up in front of her mouth as if to stop herself from crying out. Mac's forehead was drenched with sweat, and his lips trembled in fear. "It's stuck shut, it won't open," panted Mac. "What do we do, smash a window?" asked Susan. "No, God no, the cellar would kill me," returned Mac. "Let's just go out the back." "How do we get there?" "Probably through the storeroom," answered Mac. "Back by all that weird shit again? No way!" "It'll be okay, we can just rush through, come on. I'm freaked out too, we'll just go quick and then we're good." "Okay, let's go, quick," agreed Susan. They turned and made their way back into the large room. As they did, the towers rocked again and more boxes fell down into the opening they had just crossed through. They turned and looked back at their now blocked passage to the front doors. Shadows appeared to move in their peripheral vision. They took a direct course to the back of the building. Mac turned his flashlight on and led the way. Beyond the bathrooms where they had seen the animals hanging, a hall jogged to the right and became nearly pitch black. Mac trained the beam ahead of them and illuminated a corner down the hall. Here, strung from the ceiling, was another of the wooden pyramids, and directly below it was what appeared to be a pile of clothing and a work boot. The flannel shirt had dark stains on it, but the clothing didn't have the coating of dust that many of the other items in this building had. Teeth were scattered around the pile. Mac rushed down the hallway. Susan remained just behind him, her outstretched hand on his back. They turned the corner, and in front of them was another door with "Employees Only" stenciled in black lettering across it. They stopped. It seemed there was a sound coming from behind the door. Mac looked back at Susan and put his index finger up to his lips in the universal sign to call for silence. Slowly, attempting to be as quiet as he could, Mac began to apply pressure to the push bar of the door. It wouldn't open. "Not again," Mac whispered under his breath. He started to strain harder, increasing the pressure a little bit at a time, when suddenly, with two jerks and a sharp metallic screech, the door swung open. Mac grabbed it before it slammed against the inner wall. Then they froze in horror from what they saw. The storage room in front of them was packed full of crates, boxes, tarps, and large cleaning equipment. A single light streamed down from above in the center of the room, and shadows flickered all around. There, on a raised cardboard plateau beneath the electric glow, danced a large gray squirrel and a cottontail rabbit. They were suspended on unseen wires and clearly had been dead for some time. Mac and Susan had interrupted a scene that had been playing out between the two. The rabbit twitched in a silly dance. Giggles echoed from the shadows all around the room. The squirrel then began to bounce up and down and tittered gibberish at the rabbit. The two marionettes danced together as the room filled with the same laughter they had heard several times before. As Mac looked in the room, he noticed something beyond the dancing puppets. He focused his gaze in the shadows to try and make it out. That was when he screamed. The rabbit and squirrel comically turned on their strings and looked at the two in the doorway. So did the two pairs of dimly luminous eyes and toothy grins that were hidden behind them. The eyes were gray-green, like fireflies amidst a thick fog or smoke, and the teeth were like rows of jagged white tombstones. Both stood out in the inky black shadows in which they were perched. The puppets were flung aside, and the dark faces began to rush toward the door. Max slammed it closed and shouted at Susan to run, but as he turned, he saw that she already had. He was looking ahead and tripped over something just as he saw her turn the corner in front of him. His feet made a loud stomping shuffle as he stumbled. As he staggered, he thought he heard a short cry from Susan up ahead. He heard another sound from all around him as well. The sound of echoing, growing laughter. Much louder than before, but just the same as the laughter he'd heard in the back room at the grotesque marionette show. He was able to regain his balance and continue forward. When he came around the corner, Susan was nowhere to be seen. She knew the way out and had been in front of him, and maybe she had rushed on ahead. The nightmarish chuckle continued to amplify. It buzzed into Mac's brain and threatened to drive him insane. It found its way to the root of all of his fears. He tripped again as he jogged his way toward the front of the building. Then again, and this time he fell. As he tumbled, he turned around, landing on his butt, raising his hands up to his face to protect him from what he was sure would be there. There was nothing but the sound of the laughter and the toppling boxes that he had run into. One of the wooden pyramids, along with a rat and bird carcass, dropped into his lap. He frantically brushed them away and scrambled to his feet. And just then, as he started to run, he felt something cold sting into his right bicep. As he looked down, he suddenly felt a jerk on that arm that wrenched him backward. Then as he turned to run again, he felt another similar feeling simultaneously on his left wrist and his right calf. He turned to take another step and couldn't. He was held in place. He screamed. Then he was jerked backwards into a pile of boxes, and everything went black. He had a pounding headache, but he was being shaken awake. He heard his name. Mac! Mac, wake up! It was Susan. He recognized that much. He opened his eyes, but everything was a blur. He could feel the sting of sweat in his eyes. He could see the blurred outline of Susan before him. He attempted to move his arm up to his face, but it was jerked back to his side. That was when he noticed he was standing. Although standing wasn't quite the right word. He was upright, but it felt like he was being held that way against his will. His body was weak, limp. He tried to bring his hand up again. This time he fought against the force that was pulling it away from him. He couldn't overcome the pull. But then it stopped, and his wrist and forearm smacked into his nose hard enough to make his eyes water. He took the opportunity to wipe them and blink a few times. His arm was pulled back to a semi-upright but dangling position next to his side. Susan was before him. She was suspended too, by wires that bit into her arms, legs, and neck that caused little droplets of blood to ooze out. Some of it glistened off the wires themselves, making them easier to see than the ones that had barred the front door earlier. They were in the storeroom, under the single central light they had seen before. The two dangled there, facing each other. Susan looked as if she were trying to speak, but it also appeared that the wire around her neck had tightened. She began to choke and cough. And then she jiggled and her arms waved around. Foolish gibberish such as they had heard before when the squirrel and rabbit were talking came to his ears. This was followed by more of the laughter. Susan grimaced in pain as she was moved in this way, but she made no sound. He tried to call out, to say something to her, to call for help, to say anything. He choked as the wire around his own neck tightened, just enough to send him into a coughing fit. In the midst of that fit, searing cold electrical pain racked his extremities as his own body danced out of his control to the sound of the monstrous gibbering. The laughter was non-stop now, as though these grinning things in the shadows couldn't contain themselves any longer. There was nothing either of them could do but watch one another as they danced. They were growing weak. They were losing blood. He felt the noose tighten as he tried to scream again. Susan had gone limp, making her suspension even more grotesquely like a true-life marionette. As he attempted to yell, he felt the wire on his throat tighten even further. For a few seconds, while he could still see, one of the toothy grins and a pair of eyes rushed up at him out of the darkness from behind Susan. It came very close to his face. It radiated an icy coldness that made every inch of him tingle and shiver. It was much larger than he had imagined at first. If the mouth opened, he thought, it could swallow him whole. But it didn't open. It just stared at him and smiled. It shook with the maniacal laughter that seemed to come from all around, but that must have somehow been coming from this thing. Then everything faded to blackness, and the last thing Mac ever sensed was the laughing of the shadows. All day and all night in the back room of the old Grand Slam, they would have so much fun. They had fulfilled their obligation to her, and now they were free to play however they wanted. They could collect whatever toys they wished for themselves. It made them laugh. The laughter made them feel full. It made them feel so much stronger. One by one they took turns, dancing their toys and giggling, back and forth, prancing in and out of the shadows, laughing and laughing and laughing. Alice couldn't decide if she wanted it to be a dream or not. That morning she woke up in the same spot in camp where she had rested her head the night before. She looked for footprints in the grass where she had followed the lamp into the hills, but there was nothing. Her memories of the webs, bullets, bandits' blood, and the emerald hawk moth were broken. They were weighed down with a confusing abstractness that had not pummeled her dreams at this volume before. She felt completely unsure of herself and what she believed, to the point that it numbed her appetite and made her weepy. The morning was normal enough on the plains. The sky was clear enough that the blue seemed boundless. The sun was flickering between drags of clouds, spitting blobs of shadow along the hills. The breeze rattled everything with its omnipresent howl. Large flies clung to the tops of reeds along the riverbanks, their silky glass wings twitching nervously, knowing that if they released their tiny grips, the wind would toss them like marbles. It was hard for Alice to focus on anything but what she had witnessed last night. She sat against the river, dangling her little feet inside the water, hoping that nature itself would suddenly speak and tell her what to believe. Surely it had watched her, like it did everyone. Maybe the fish had seen her wander away with that walking lantern. She wished they would float to the surface and whisper an answer to her. "There's someone coming," one of her brothers yelled. They were further up the hill from the river. "Is it Pa?" Alice asked, jumping up and running barefoot into the grasses. As she turned around, a shape was reflected in the water for one moment. It was large, dark, and erratically spiked. She was too excited to acknowledge it. She climbed the yellowish slab of hill upwards away from their camp and stopped. Her family was lined up at the top, watching something. Alice went to stand by them, but her brother shoved her away. "Go stand over there, firehead, you stink of fish," Sam snarled. He had realized the visitor was not their father, and he targeted his unresolved anger towards Alice, which was routine. "Stifle yourself. I'm cleaner than you, Samuel," Alice said, crossing her arms and curling her lip. "Quiet, Alice. You'll alert the whole of the plains," her mom hissed. Alice shook her head. The bridge would never talk to her this way, she thought. Ahead of the family, a single horse was trotting toward them, moving down and up over the barrels of land like a raindrop that refused to settle or evaporate. It was brown, with patches of white and an empty saddle. The animal eventually reached them, and the family instantly started to paw and inspect it. The horse was happy for the attention. It preened and wandered in front of them, pushing its forehead into their bodies for affection. The only person not touching the animal was Alice. "I wonder who this horse belongs to," her mother said. "It isn't Pa's horse. Who might own it?" Sam said. Alice could not fully listen to their words. She was simply trying to keep calm. Just along the horse's backside, behind the saddle, was a line of cobweb sewn into its flesh like stitching. It was the exact material from the night before that had snared all those bullets and sounds. When she stared at it, the world seemed to go silent. A song echoed somewhere in the hills. Alice had a hard time controlling her bodily functions. She wanted to lean forward and stroke the wound, make sure it was real, but the moment she walked toward the animal, it let out a snort and dashed back down the hill away from their perch, tossing globs of dirt in the wake of its hooves. "As is consistent with life, Alice ruined everything," Sam said. He turned and headed back down to camp along with the rest of her family, who grumbled about her under their breath. Alice did not follow. She just stood watching the scene. Ahead of her, the mounds of grass jostled to the wind. They were like little jade follicles on a sleeping giant's back. She could not move her eyes from the horizon. Far out, nearly beyond the curved lines of the terrain, 3 teal lights appeared to hover, then disappear into the ground. The sky went dark suddenly, as though she was staring into some skyward pit. Alice blinked and rubbed her elbows with her hands. Fear came over her, a deep, instinctual fear, which made her body feel heavy and cumbersome. She felt she could barely take a single step without collapsing. "What's happening?" she mumbled to herself. As if the sullen heavens could hear her little voice, the light flickered back from its spell, as if it had just been a private eclipse. Some voices murmured in her mind as it ended. She could not tell who was trying to speak to her. They faded as quickly as they appeared. Alice slowly walked back to camp. She did not say anything to her family as she passed them. They were cooking some fish and biscuits for breakfast. Not a single eye from the 3 of them bothered to look up at her from the campfire's smoke. Not that Alice expected them to. She was constantly reassured that nobody liked her. It seemed to be the only consistent thing in her life. She decided to walk along the river and look at flowers. She could make another wreath. Maybe make one for her mom as an apology for scaring the horse away. She hadn't gotten far downriver when the bridge appeared. Alice turned back toward her family, surprised. It had only been a few moments since she left. Only the river looked back at her. It was one yawning line, mirroring the sky above her head. Red-winged blackbirds scouring the reeds had become still. Flies and gnats vanished amongst the undergrowth. A stillness washed over the world where even the bends of the riverbank stood as silent as tombstones. She could not see the campfire or her family. How long had she been walking for? "Hello, Alice. I'm pleased to see you," a voice said. She looked back at the rocky line hanging over the water. The words were not echoing from the darkness beneath the structure, but from somewhere behind her. The bridge looked larger than before. The stones and mortar were more spiked and sharp, like teeth. Alice didn't reply. She knew what was speaking to her. "Are you well, Alice?" the voice said. It sounded more like a statement than a question. "I'm never well," she said, grimacing. "You should be, Alice." "I walked toward a horse for a moment and they despised me for it," she said, starting to sob. She fell to her knees. In her dress, she could feel the damp grass that pressed like rough spines into her legs. The sounds of her rapid breathing catching in her chest made her ashamed to be weeping, but she also didn't care. She was tired of being sad all the time and not showing it. Why did her family hate her? "Look ahead of you, Alice," the voice said. Alice peeked between her tear-dripped fingers, which she had wrapped around her pale face like a shield. Directly in front of her, the emerald hawk moth hovered by the bridge, floating over the water, which strangely did not reflect the coruscating halo of suspended fire. It appeared to you here, and on the hills. "Do you know why, Alice?" the voice asked. Alice did not reply. She could only think of the night before when it had taken shape and killed all those bandits on the bottom of the hill. It had happened in seconds. Their bodies were nothing more than wreckage being pulled and stuffed into an ethereal drain. Would she be killed too? "No," Alice finally said after a few moments. "You are special, Alice. You are not like the others." Alice laughed. "How am I special?" she said, shaking her head. Her bangs were matted with sweat and her nose was running. Her inner lip was bleeding from where she had been gnawing on it in her anxiety. A presence had appeared behind her. She could feel it, blocking the wind. She started to turn around, but her body did not want to listen to her. "Look, Alice." The emerald hawk moth separated. The bridge had grown. It towered over Alice. The sky faded behind its craggy complexion. So did the prairie. There was only bridge ahead, behind, and all around her. There was a wheezing sound rattling from it, like the structure was trying to breathe. The flames dashed beneath it, through the slab of blackness, which seemed so deep it was as if Alice's own eyes could be pulled out of her head as she gazed into it. The void stretched into a tunnel. The blue fires attached to shadowy walls like torches. I saw them appear to you, Alice. The Emerald Hawkmoth. They watched you from across the plains. They gravitate toward you. The hole beneath the bridge suddenly brightened, emblazoned by some supernatural vigor. A tapestry formed beneath a shimmering sheet of tiny lights, the same color as the Emerald Hawkmoth. The dots of blue faded in a sizzle, leaving behind an image. Alice's vision became even more magnetized by what she was witnessing. It was a living picture of magic and wonder. Stone castles floating on clouds with blue flags dancing on their battlements. Dragons with glowing green hides, hard like steeled leather, swooping across the sky. Mountains extended beneath with black peaks, holding a honeycomb of caves with windows of jewels and gold. A nearby plateau was covered in petrified trees with a chubby troll napping in a clearing. The scene played in front of Alice, unaware of her presence. "What am I seeing?" she asked. "These are the Deadlands. Worlds gone from this one to which I can still travel. And you can as well," the voice said. "They're beautiful," Alice said. The image suddenly changed to a room that stretched into a hallway full of knobs of mushrooms prickled into the walls. They were piled atop one another like scales on a serpent. Each was covered in a chalky shine of dust. On the floor beneath them were a variety of dead bodies caked in cobwebs, twisted and posed in rigor mortis. Alice recoiled and blinked. The fantasy returned as quickly as it had vanished. Alice was again mesmerized by it. "Would you like to see them?" the voice said. Alice managed to turn her head toward the river. No one from her family was there. "Yes," she said. A blindfold wrapped around her eyes. It was scratchy, damp, and stunk of salt. "I'm sorry, Alice. You're not prepared to see me. You're not yet adequate." Something gripped her left hand. It was hard, fibrous, but sharp. Its surface was random and pointy, but also warm. It was like holding the hand of a living gargoyle. She could feel her soft skin wanting to retract from it. The blood in her capillaries did not want to be near it. Her flesh went cold. "What should I call you?" Alice felt a coolness wash over her, like they were entering a large room. She felt a compulsion to run, but her body was not really hers anymore. "You can call me by my old name, my human one. Not any of the others given to me by frightened eyes." Alice wanted to stop walking, but could not. "Human name?" Alice said, panicking. There was silence. The world paused to listen. Ishkode. Back at camp, James was in a good mood. His father had just returned to fix the wagon. By the afternoon, they hoped to be back on the trail again. James' mom had told him to find Alice. She had missed the food and Pa coming back. She had probably gotten lost along the riverbanks or fallen in the water, he thought. He scoffed and picked at his scalp. The prospect of having to swim for her was tedious. He rounded a bend of reeds and wildflower and stopped. Far ahead of him was a large bridge, sitting over the water. Walking toward it were two figures. One was the unmistakable form of Alice. She looked blindfolded, confused, and being led along by someone. That was when James could no longer stand or understand his own thoughts. Something tall, wide, and flowing was guiding her by the hand toward the bottom of the bridge. It was not a person, but had the general shape of one. Shoulders, a head, arms, legs, but they were distorted by some sort of constantly moving garment, which mixed with the air and colors around them. It seemed to have hands, but the one Alice was gripping was jagged and wild, a collection of overgrown bones and flesh. The more he stared at the fabric, the more the cloth seemed to form into a hood and shroud. There appeared to be an array of bones dangling in strings from its edges. Then they were beneath the bridge. As soon as they entered that space, the curled rock clapped shut like a clam. Water fired upwards in a geyser, earth rolled away, crumbling from its base, and a whining sound like an engine growling filled the prairie air. Then a spine of emerald energy laced upwards. The bridge was gone. And so was Alice. The Hidden Oaks podcast is a collaboration between Patrick W. Marsh, Robert Dawn, and Owen Swerkstrom. The stories Keep Off the Grass and Shadowplay by Robert Dawn. Ishkode by Patrick W. Marsh. The voice of Hidden Oaks, Father Witherow, Agent Friedman, and the two bishops, performed by Robert Dawn. The voice of Mira, performed by Robin Sand. Original music composed and performed by David Schwartz. Find more of his works at dtschwartz.com. Produced by Robert Dawn, Owen Swerkstrom, and Patrick W. Marsh. You can find out more online by visiting us at hiddenoakspodcast.com or by finding us on Twitter at Hidden Oaks Pod, as well as Facebook and Instagram at Hidden Oaks Podcast. Hidden Oaks is an Ironfield independent production. Thank you for listening, and until next time.